Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I say that because we're speaking at the UN Crime Congress based in Kyoto, but broadcast around the world. Our topic is the use and implementation of life imprisonment, and we're delighted to be part of this Congress, and in particular to be part of this very distinguished panel. My co-author, Catherine Appleton, and I, Dirk van Smit, have been studying life imprisonment for some years, and much of what we have to say is based on our recent book, which too deals with, and indeed is the first attempt to describe life imprisonment as a global phenomenon. What we hope to do in this paper is to explain to you not only that life imprisonment is a particularly important problem in world penology now, but also to give you a little bit of an idea of how complicated it is, because I sometimes think it is precisely these complexities which have led to a major issue in penology being overlooked. The first difficulty with life imprisonment is simply to decide precisely what we mean by it. Catherine and I have used a simple, straightforward definition. For us, life imprisonment is a sentence following a criminal conviction which gives the state the power to detain people in prison for life, that is, until they die there. Different countries have slightly different names for life imprisonment, but briefly, formal life sentences, those are sentences imposed by a court, can be divided into a number of categories. You get irreducible sentences, sentences from which no one may ever be released on parole, often called LWOP, life without parole. You get life sentences which have the possibility of parole, and occasionally you get what we call symbolic life sentences, where it is more or less guaranteed that someone will eventually be released. But they are rare. In the vast majority of life sentences imposed by the court, there is always the possibility that someone will be kept in prison until they die there. And then we have informal life sentences too. Someone is sentenced to 100 years. Well, unless they're released early, they too will certainly die in prison. Also, countries impose things which they don't call life sentences, but they say they're indefinite or indeterminate. Well, according to our definition, those are life sentences too. Catherine will now tell you a little bit about where these different sentences are found and just how prevalent they are worldwide.
Thank you, Dirk. So here is a map that we're particularly proud of. It plots for the whole world in different shades of grey, where the countries have formal life imprisonment and what kind of life imprisonment they have. So either life with parole or life without parole. So what can we say from this? Well, firstly, we can now say that life imprisonment is a statutory penalty in 183 countries out of a total of 216 countries and territories in the world. You can hopefully see amidst the grey that life with parole is the most common type of life imprisonment in the world. In 145 of the 183 countries, that's around 79%, they have formal life imprisonment where there is some provision for release. But we were also able to identify 65 countries that impose whole life sentences or life without parole. One very surprising finding to us is that there are 33 countries that do not impose life imprisonment or the death penalty as the ultimate sanction. If you can spot the lightest shades of grey, you might be able to see Norway or Portugal, Brazil, Colombia there. You will hopefully be able to recognise these on the map. These are countries with no life imprisonment. The other thing to draw your attention to on this map is that there are some countries that have both life without parole and life with parole sentences. An example is the United States. Indeed, all countries on there with little down stripes. Both China and India have recently introduced whole life sentences. One other thing worth noticing is federal countries, quite tricky. But if you look at Mexico, Mexico has more than 30 states. Most of them have no life imprisonment at all, but those that do have life imprisonment have whole life sentences or life without parole. Or look at the US, another clear example. It actually looks as if every state has both. But no, if you spot Alaska up there at the top, they have no formal life imprisonment at all. Instead, Alaska can impose a 99-year fixed term sentence, so a severe form of de facto life or informal life. So that's a picture of the world and the prevalence of life imprisonment overall. But we were also able to collect some trend data from several countries. So using these trends together with data from other sources, we were able to estimate the growth in the total number of life sentence prisoners around the world from 2000 to 2014. You'll see the majority of countries fall into the orange colour there, the rest of the world category. And you will hopefully be able to see here how 5 countries have made a major contribution to the world life sentence prison population. These are the US, India, South Africa, the UK and Turkey, and the USA is the blue one on the bottom there. The US is a significant outlier. We can basically see that the US housed around a third of the world life sentence prison population in 2014. In terms of total numbers then, so in 2000 we estimate that there were approximately 261,000 prisoners, and that this has increased dramatically to around 479,000 prisoners up to 2014. So in other words, we can say that the world life sentence prison population almost doubled, or increased by 80% between 2000 and the year 2014, which is that black line there. Quite a staggering rise in the number of people subject to formal life imprisonment. If we compare this to the fewer than 20,000 prisoners who were awaiting execution on death row in 2014. And of course, this does not include prisoners serving informal life sentences, a much more difficult picture to build, but no doubt, I'm sure the numbers would be more dramatic still. And we're currently collating a second round of data collection on life imprisonment around the world. And we expect this trend to continue upwards, as you can see from our estimates here. So based on the findings up to 2014, we were able to predict that by 2020, or last year, the numbers of life sentence prisoners around the world will be over 500,000. And this is something we're hoping to check with our second round of data collection. We do know from a recent publication by the Sentencing Project in the US that the total number of people serving LWOP sentences, life with parole sentences, or sentences of 50 years or more, so-called virtual life, or what we would call our informal life sentence, de facto life, this has reached the grand total of over 200,000 people now, a highly worrying situation. That's probably more than enough about the numbers for now. Part of the research that I found most interesting and perhaps most concerning is the treatment of life sentence prisoners around the world and the experience of what is it like to serve a life sentence across different jurisdictions. Now, 2 really worrying issues emerged. Firstly, life sentence prisoners are often subjected to heightened security measures compared to other prisoners and routinely segregated on the basis of their sentence. They are also often handcuffed or shackled during movement from cells within the prison, subject to cell and body searches. They are often allowed fewer visits or time outside of their cells compared to other prisoners on the basis of their sentence. And in some countries, guard dogs are used to escort life sentence prisoners around the prison. To give you an example of this, just in recent weeks, the CPT published its report on Ukraine with a focus on life sentence prisoners held at one particular prison. They mentioned the positive first, that systematically, that life sentence prisoners have stopped being systematically handcuffed when they're taken out of their cells. However, they go on to mention that they continue to be subjected to demeaning practices, such as making them run in the corridor in a half squatting position or walk bent over at the waist with their hands lifted during escorts. The committee, of course, calls upon the Ukrainian authorities to put an immediate end to these practices. Secondly, life sentence prisoners are often living in poor conditions, including poor living conditions, or excluded from work or rehabilitation programs as an additional punishment within their sentence. Of further concern is the routine use of solitary confinement among life sentence prisoners. Many life prisoners are not only segregated from other prisoners in high security institutions, but are routinely confined to their cells, either alone or in pairs, for up to 23 or 24 hours per day. We know, for example, that the life sentence system in Turkey automatically subjects a subgroup of life sentence prisoners to a prison regime of solitary confinement from the beginning of their sentence. In Tajikistan too, where only LWOP sentences are imposed, prisoners are subjected to solitary confinement conditions for the rest of their lives. And the CPT report on the situation of life sentence prisoners in the Ukraine also highlighted a concern that many life sentence prisoners continue to be locked up for 23 hours per day, their only out-of-cell activity being 1 hour of outdoor exercise, which was taken on a cell-by-cell basis in small cubicles. Now, in our research, we also looked at published accounts from lifers themselves, and it became very clear that the so-called pains of imprisonment are particularly heightened for this group of prisoners, primarily due to the indeterminate nature of the sentence, which is unique to life imprisonment. And these are heightened further for individuals serving LWOP. So I've just given you 2 examples on the slides there. One says it's like going deep sea diving, going all the way to the bottom and losing your oxygen. The other one is an LWOP prisoner who compares his life sentence to a death sentence. Indeed, depending on how life imprisonment is implemented, it can be experienced as a fate worse than the death penalty. And we would argue that death penalty abolitionists should proceed with caution when considering their ultimate penalty. However, it's not all bad news. We're also able to identify examples and initiatives from different jurisdictions that incorporate human rights principles, and we wanted to draw attention to these just now, with the aim of reducing the human costs of serving a life sentence. For example, in terms of sentence planning, in some countries, life sentence prisoners undergo an initial assessment in a high security prison, which is then used to create an individualized sentence plan before being transferred to the main system. In terms of the principle of normalization, this is a principle that some Scandinavian systems have endeavored to incorporate into their correctional system. In Denmark, for example, life sentence prisoners typically live in units where they are responsible for collectively managing a budget, deciding what to cook, what to eat, ordering food from the prison shop, and preparing and cooking their own meals. Finally, in many parts of the world, life sentence prisoners have access to a range of purposeful activities, normally in association with other prisoners, and often linked to the wider community resources such as education providers or employment agencies. Back in the time when we were allowed to travel, I was lucky enough to go to Moldova and link up with the Norwegian Mission for the Rule of Law there. And during my trip, got to enjoy a production of Hamlet by the life sentence prisoners there who were working with a local professional theatre company. This was a huge achievement by everyone involved at the time. But again, this is a resource that has now been cut due to a change in the Minister of Justice. And the lifers there, I understand, are back into a solitary confinement regime. But we do know that the punishment might be life imprisonment, but the goal can continue to be to prepare the prisoner for release into the community and for life after life imprisonment. So at that point, I will hand you back to Dirk. Thank you very much.
Well, this brings me back to my initial theme of complexity. In order to understand life imprisonment, one has to understand on whom life sentences are imposed. And it's important to recognize that children are mostly excluded. Indeed, the Convention on the Rights of the Child say that you may never impose life without parole on children and strongly discourages its use generally. They are, in many countries, not imposed on elderly prisoners, and in some, not on women. There's a lot to be debated about, therefore, who should get a life sentence. Equally controversial is what is life imprisonment imposed for? Clearly, it is imposed in most countries for very serious offences, but it is often imposed for offences that are significantly less serious than those that would carry capital punishment. The result is that where life imprisonment becomes the ultimate penalty, it is used excessively. The other thing to ponder is how is life imprisonment imposed? Is it mandatory or discretionary? Do courts have a choice? If they impose life sentences, do they set the minimum periods before release can be considered? And finally, in this regard, it's worth noting that life sentences are often imposed by the executive in practice. A lot of people are sentenced to death, few are executed, the rest are given life sentences, often without thinking through clearly what this entails. Another factor of life imprisonment that is enormously important and complex is the possibility of release. We have spoken about life without parole, but the reality is that for many, many lifers, what keeps them alive is the possibility, the hope that they may be released. Now, how is this done? Our research has shown that it can be done by courts, parole boards, or by the executive. Broadly speaking, courts, simply because they are impartial, are the best at this, but they need to have proper information to be able to do so. Parole boards can also be effective as long as they are sufficiently independent. The executive is frankly the worst way of deciding on the release of lifers because the executive is subject to political pressures. When should release from life be considered? Well, I've already said that in some cases the courts set that. That is probably the best way of doing it. Alternatively, you could have it set in legislation. There's a very strong indication that it should not ever be people kept for longer than 25 years before being considered for release, and there's a strong argument for making it shorter. Other speakers will be speaking about human rights developments. Let me just say briefly that in order to understand life imprisonment, in order to do the things that Catherine and I have been talking about, it's important to focus on the dignity of prisoners. It's important that the life sentence should be proportionate, that is, not imposed for offences that are not sufficiently serious, and also proportionate in the sense of them being released when they are in a position to do so. What is important in this regard is that they all retain hope for the future. International human rights instruments will be spoken about too later. Let me just say that with the exception of the 1994 UN report on life imprisonment, there is little at the international level about this. The Council of Europe has a recommendation on the management of sentenced life prisoners, but there's much more to be done in this area by applying the very interesting general principles emerging from documents such as the Nelson Mandela rules. Finally, what is to be done about life imprisonment? Well, we would strongly argue, and I'm sure this will be discussed further, about for the abolition of life without parole sentences, because they don't give prisoners hope. We would argue that they should be reserved for the most serious crimes. We would abolish all mandatory life sentences because they take away the discretion from courts. We would argue in favor of human rights compliant implementation for the reasons that Catherine has mentioned. I would argue very strongly for an independent release mechanism. And finally, given what we have found that there are 33 countries that manage without these, and of which I'm sure by now the Portuguese Minister of Justice has spoken, it is possible to imagine a system which has neither life nor death. Thank you very, very much for your attention. We are always delighted to speak to people about life imprisonment. Please contact us at the University of Nottingham and look at our website there. And thanks again for the privilege of speaking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.